Kansas City police called it the most bizarre murder case they'd ever seen, because the killer clearly left a message. And the forensic scientists found another message at the scene, microscopic in size, but unmistakable in clarity. One Friday afternoon in 2000, some people returning from lunch heard strange noises coming from one of the offices. The woman found her boss, Richard Armitage, on the floor behind his desk in a pool of blood. She called for his partner, Richard Buckley, to help.
At this point, Armitage was still alive. He was still fighting for his life.
She went to the phone, called 911. She heard some noises, the clapping sound. Mr. Buckley was attempting to revive Mr. Armitage.
Armitage was rushed to the hospital and went immediately into surgery.
He had swelling on the brain. Things did not look good at all. In fact, from what we were hearing from the doctors, it was just a matter of time.
His kids were all there, and I leaned over his bed and I said, if you want to go, go. You know, you can go. I let him go. I let him go, which was very hard.
Armitage never regained consciousness.
We knew that we were going to have a homicide on our hands, and it was going to be pretty difficult to solve.
The autopsy revealed Armitage had been struck 9 times in the head with a blunt object, possibly a hammer.
It looked like the person who had done this was very angry at the time because of the type of wounds that he had to his skull, very deep, very open wounds. It could have been either passion, it could have been just straight out anger. We didn't know at that point.
Richard Armitage was a lawyer whose practice was primarily related to organ transplantation and donation issues. Not surprisingly, his heart and other organs were donated to 3 different recipients.
It was very difficult for the kids, very difficult. I think they're proud of their dad and the fact that even in his death, he still helped somebody else. So they're proud of him. He's still around.
Everyone in Kansas City was shocked at the sheer brutality of the crime.
It was a broad daylight attack in a busy downtown office building. And the victim was a man who seemed well-liked, well-respected, working in a very esoteric area of law, organ transplant. And the mystery was who could have done this, who could have slipped into this building and done this.
No one working in the building saw anyone leave the office with bloody clothing. But forensic experts say the killer might not have had any blood on him.
There was no guarantee that there would be blood on the assailant of any kind. If you're using a hammer, you impact that object, really the energy is dispersed away from the assailant. The person comes in and commits the beating and leaves, and there's very little evidence, if any, on that person.
No one, not friends, family, or business associates, could name a potential suspect.
To find a lawyer slain in his office in broad daylight was highly unusual. It was something the city had not seen before.
But investigators discovered Armitage did other types of legal work besides organ transplantation law. Was it possible that something in his past may have resurfaced? Richard Armitage was just 51 years old when he was found murdered in his office. Friends and colleagues couldn't understand who would have wanted to harm him.
Rich had children from a previous marriage, and Rich and Kathy had a child not long after getting married, and Allie was just an adorable little girl and seemed to be the happy couple and really enjoying life to the fullest.
Both his ex-wife and his current wife were ruled out as suspects, since they each had an alibi for the time of the murder.
We looked at also some of his friends, particularly one of his best friends. There wasn't a bad word between them. There wasn't any problems between them.
Investigators knew that whoever killed Richard Armitage was within arm's length when he struck the fatal blows.
We believe that the first blow knocked him out of his chair and that he did not have a chance to move. Again, the crime scene tells us that all of the blows were probably delivered while Armitage was laying on the floor on his side, and there were no defensive wounds. There was no sign really of a struggle.
Because his shoes were sitting neatly beside his desk, it was clear Richard wasn't expecting anyone.
We had learned that whenever Richard Armitage would go into his office, sit at his desk, he'd take his shoes off. So he was very comfortable. When he was attacked, he had his shoes off. He didn't have his shoes on. He'd never moved from that desk. He'd never gone anywhere.
Blood spatter patterns clearly indicated Armitage's back was turned when the attack began.
He seemed like he was very comfortable at his desk, just kicked back, working on things. I think they said he was ordering perfume for his wife for Mother's Day, and then came in and was completely surprised by the attack, apparently.
Detectives checked his appointment calendar. No meetings were scheduled for that day. Phone records showed that Armitage completed his last call at 2:01 p.m. His secretary and law partner found his body at 2:30. When police arrived, the blood had started to clot, which meant the murder occurred closer to 2 o'clock.
He lay there for a period of time. Normal, healthy individuals who are not taking anticoagulants normally will clot or begin to clot within 3 to 15 minutes.
Armitage's partner, Richard Buckley, said he was at lunch at the time, so did his secretary. And there was no one else in the office.
The only three people in the law firm were Richard Buckley, Richard Armitage, and the secretary. They were the only office on this floor. This was a very big floor. The rest of the floor was vacant.
They really didn't know if it had been someone who had just come in off the street, if it was a matter of a former disgruntled client, if it was someone from his personal life.
In addition to his organ donation clients, Armitage did collection work.
Collection work has kind of a seedy reputation sometimes, but he was doing collection work for like dentists and doctors, and I think some apartment complexes.
When debts weren't paid, Armitage would send the necessary legal documents to the people who owed his clients money. Those tactics sometimes made people angry.
We came up with one name, one person who was particularly, I guess, pretty volatile on the phone, pretty angry on the phone with him, had even threatened him a couple of times.
Office records identified the man as Lou Campbell.
We got to looking into him. We did find out where he was. We then performed a search warrant at his house, and we found a bloody shirt, and then we found some bloody pants, and we thought, well, this might be our person.
The clothing was sent for DNA testing, but the blood belonged to Campbell and not Richard Armitage. That didn't necessarily exclude him as a suspect.
It would not be outside of the realm of possibilities that there was no blood on the attacker, and that comes back to the physics involved when you're impacting a bloody object. If you're using a hammer, you impact that object, really the energy is dispersed away from the assailants.
When investigators looked at security camera videotapes to see if Lou Campbell had entered Armitage's office building on the day of the murder, they found a big surprise. Kansas City police screened the videotapes from security cameras in the lobby of Richard Armitage's office building. They expected to see Lou Campbell, who had threatened Armitage over a legal dispute. But instead, they saw Armitage's law partner, Richard Buckley, walking through the lobby at a different time than he first claimed.
He had told us earlier that he'd left for lunch at approximately 1:50 in the afternoon.
He was leaving at about On the tape, I believe it was 2:06. And you can make out the fact that he had a briefcase over his shoulder.
Buckley's explanation was simple, that he was mistaken about the time he left for lunch. But police realized this time difference meant Buckley and Armitage were in the office alone for approximately 5 minutes before Buckley left for lunch.
Could that be enough time for him to have attacked Mr. Armitage? Yes. And done what he done and then try to get away? Yes.
Buckley denied he had anything to do with the murder, and police found no blood or anything suspicious in Buckley's briefcase. Buckley said when he left for lunch, Armitage was on the telephone. He said he walked through the lobby, went to a fast food restaurant, then bought some items at an office supply store. The receipt showed he was there at 2:22. Buckley said he then returned to the office, had a cigarette outside, and when he saw his secretary, they both went back into the office together at approximately 2:30. That's when they found Richard's body. His story seemed to hold up, especially when police recalled his appearance just minutes after the body was found.
Richard Buckley, when we first contacted him, he had no blood on him. It didn't appear that he had been in a fight. It didn't appear that anything had happened.
But when police looked into Buckley's background, they found some disturbing information. Armitage handled the organ transplant side of the business and did very well. Buckley handled civil cases and was doing poorly.
Richard Buckley was a very bad lawyer. He spent a lot of money on witnesses. He spent a lot of money on things he probably didn't need to spend money on, and then when he got to trial, for whatever reason, he just couldn't win a case.
Financial records indicated that Buckley had amassed a debt of more than $250,000.
Richard told me about Buckley's debt. He would rob Peter to pay Paul, and he would borrow $10,000 to go to Colorado to do a deposition, and then he'd lose the case. And then he put a lot of money in some of these cases, and he'd lose them.
Armitage was apparently no longer willing to cover Buckley's debts, and his accountant said he was thinking of dissolving the partnership. This would have left Richard Buckley with no income. And as Armitage's law partner, Buckley was the beneficiary of a $150,000 life insurance payment in the event of Armitage's death, a clear motive for murder. So despite the fact that Buckley's clothing looked clean, investigators sent his shirt, jeans, and sneakers to the forensic lab for testing. And almost immediately, forensic analysts saw something nearly invisible to the naked eye.
I was very surprised when I pulled out the shirt. That was the first thing that I pulled out to look at. And I knew immediately that this was high-velocity blood spatter. There wasn't very much there, though I could see it very clearly.
This kind of high-velocity spatter can only be created when the person wearing the clothes is in close proximity to a blood source being struck with a great deal of force.
These small blood droplets are actually embedded between the fibers, indicating that they've been forcibly driven in, as opposed to a light transfer of blood, which will only be visible on the tops of the fiber bundles.
Altogether, there were 61 specks of blood on Buckley's clothing, each no bigger than a pinpoint. DNA testing proved the blood was Richard Armitage's. When confronted with this evidence, Buckley claimed he got the blood on his clothes when he tried to revive Armitage, specifically when he clapped his hands to see if Armitage was conscious. Was this a plausible explanation? Forensic experts were ready to put it to the test. Richard Buckley denied killing his law partner, Richard Armitage, despite the fact his partner's blood was found on his clothing. Buckley said the blood spatter got onto his clothes when he tried to determine if Armitage was conscious.
The defense came up with the possibility that clapping would cause this fine mist or spatter, that if he had gotten his hands bloody with Armitage's blood and then was clapping, that would have caused it.
To see if this was possible, forensic experts conducted an experiment. First, an individual simulating Richard Buckley got down into a kneeling position as he would have been over Armitage's body. Instead of blood, they used strings to show where the blood on Buckley's hands would have gone had he clapped them.
And we would follow the path of these strings to see what areas were exposed, could possibly have received blood, and compare that to what areas did actually have blood.
Almost immediately, the experiment showed that any blood on Buckley's hands would not create blood spatter on his clothing in the places where it was later found. As you can see, in a kneeling position, with his legs behind him, it would have been impossible for the blood on his hands to have gotten onto his shoes. Even in a squatting position, it wouldn't have been possible.
There were small spatters of blood that were within the side crevices, recessed areas of the athletic shoes, that someone clapping, unless they've got their hands right down on the floor, it just didn't make any sense.
And in the opinion of all the forensic experts, had Buckley clapped his hands, it would not have created blood spatter on the back of his shirt.
It's not going to happen any other time. It's not going to happen when he pulls him out from the desk. It's not going to happen when he's trying to give him CPR. It's not going to happen when he's clapping his hands. It's not going to happen. It's going to happen when he's there.
Only an object dripping in blood and swung over your shoulder would produce spatter like this on the back of his shirt in a downward direction.
Now we know why what he's telling us is not adding up. So now we know that he's giving us a story. He's giving us a very good story. He's thought about this. But now we know that there are holes in his story. We know why there's holes in his story. That was our big breakthrough then.
Based on the forensic evidence, prosecutors believe Buckley planned to kill Richard Armitage when he learned Armitage planned to dissolve their partnership.
No, I'll be leaving in a minute.
Okay.
They believe Buckley brought the weapon to work, hidden in his briefcase. After the secretary left for lunch, and Armitage finished his telephone call at 2:01, Buckley entered Armitage's office and beat him to death. The repeated blows caused the blood spatter on his shirt and shoes, but perhaps most important, on the back of his shirt, virtually invisible to the naked eye. He put the weapon in his briefcase, perhaps in some type of bag to contain the blood, and left the office to get rid of it. The surveillance camera shows he left at 2:06. Police believe he disposed of the murder weapon and established an alibi by purchasing some things at the office supply store at 2:22. Then returned to the office building in time to go back inside with his secretary around 2:30.
Mr. Armitage? Oh, Mr. Buckley, can you come here?
Quick, call 911. Richard.
Before Buckley started CPR, he clapped his hands loud enough for his secretary to hear, claiming he just wanted to get a reaction, but more likely to make sure he had a plausible explanation for any blood spatter on his clothing.
Once you had a full understanding of forensic evidence of blood spatter, where this was going, how it was pointing, size, cast off, etc., his story did not fit in the path that the forensic evidence had already provided. And the forensic evidence was a fact. It was something you couldn't dispute.
Richard Buckley was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole.
My saddest thing that I have to say for him is, you did it out of greed and jealousy. And I said, the impact that you have on my kids, my family, it can never be replaced. Never, ever, ever be replaced. The damage that he had done. He has to be the most shallow, hollow individual I have ever known.
A bizarre case with an unlikely suspect, but an unassailable conviction.
I did not kill Richard Armitage.
I think that Richard Buckley's inner volcano exploded, and Richard Armitage happened to be the one that got the brunt of it.
No matter how hard you try, you can't beat physical evidence. Because most of the time you don't realize physical evidence is there. He didn't even realize that he had blood on his clothing. That was his demise.